the night Daniel held me in the kitchen and whispered those words. "We'll change the locks tomorrow so she can't come back, I promise." I believed him the way I had always believed him. Completely, without reservation, the way you believe the ground will hold when you take a step forward in the dark. I pressed my face into his shoulder and breathed. The house was finally quiet. Carol had left 3 hours earlier, after the worst Sunday dinner of my life, and I told myself this was the turning point, the moment my husband had finally chosen me. I was wrong in a way I cannot fully describe even now. Because 48 hours after that promise was whispered into my hair, my neighbor Patricia showed me a 12-second video on her phone, and the world I had been living inside split quietly down the center, the way ice cracks before it breaks. In the video, Carol and Daniel were standing in our driveway. It was dark, just the orange glow of the street lamp catching the edge of Carol's silver hair and the slope of my husband's shoulders. Carol had both hands pressed over her mouth, shaking with silent laughter. Daniel stood beside her with his arm around her, grinning the way he only ever grinned when something struck him as genuinely, unreservedly funny. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m., the same night he had held me and made his promises in the dark. The same night I had cried with relief into the collar of his shirt. I watched the video 4 times, and by the 4th time I understood that I was not watching a moment of cruelty. Exactly. I was watching a window. A crack in a wall I had been staring at for 4 years, finally letting in enough light to see the whole rotten structure behind it. But to understand how I got there, standing in Patricia's kitchen with shaking hands, watching my marriage become a punchline, you need to understand everything that came before. My grandmother's house smelled like cedar and old paperback novels, and something sweet I could never quite identify, even after 25 years of visits. Lily, my best friend since the 4th grade, always said it smelled like secrets and sugar, and I think she was right. The house sat at the end of Maple Creek Road, a pale yellow craftsman with a deep front porch and window boxes that Gran kept full of trailing petunias every summer. The floors were original white oak, worn to a warm honey color in the places where generations of feet had moved between the kitchen and the living room and the hallway to the bedrooms. The ceilings were high enough to keep you cool in the summer heat, and the radiators clicked and hissed through the winter with a rhythm I had memorized before I was 10. It was the kind of house that held you, the kind of house that remembered. When Gran died, 2 days after my 31st birthday, she left it to me. Not to my mother, not to my uncle, who had always fancied himself the sentimental one at family gatherings while quietly calculating the square footage of any room he entered. To me. There was a letter inside the envelope with the deed, 3 pages in her looping, careful handwriting, the ink slightly thicker at the beginning of each line where she had pressed hard with concentration. In it, she said she had watched me from the time I was a small child and knew that I was the one who would tend things. Her word, tend, like a garden, like something living that needed patience and consistency and daily, unhurried love. She said she trusted me to keep the house feeling like a home and not merely a property. I wept for an hour in the attorney's office, somewhat to his alarm. Then I drove to Maple Creek Road and let myself in with the spare key that had lived on my key ring for so long I had stopped noticing it. I made a cup of tea in her kitchen. My kitchen, though I could not yet say the word without something tightening in my chest, and sat at the pine table where she had taught me to make pie crust. I pressed both palms flat on the surface and felt the grain of the wood under my fingers and let the weight of it settle over me. Not grief, not only grief, but something heavier and more permanent, responsibility, belonging. I was 31 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I had a place that was entirely, unreservedly mine. Daniel proposed 4 months later. We had been together for 2 years by then, and I loved him with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who has finally stopped looking and can rest. He was steady and quiet, an architect who sketched floor plans on paper napkins at restaurants and got genuinely excited when he recognized original architectural details in old buildings. The first weekend I brought him to Gran's house, He moved through every room slowly, his hands touching door frames and window casings, his face open and attentive. He pressed a palm flat against the plaster in the hallway and said softly, as if to himself, "This house has good bones." I kissed him right there in the hallway between the bedroom and the bath and thought, so do we. We married the following spring in the backyard under a rented arch of white roses. The photographs show us laughing, genuinely with our whole faces, the way you can only laugh when you are not performing happiness but simply feeling it. I moved his drafting table into the second bedroom and called it his studio, and we spent the first summer painting the kitchen a warm cream color, replacing the leaky faucet in the guest bath, tearing out a section of overgrown boxwood along the front walk and planting lavender in its place. In the evenings, we sat on the porch and listened to the street settle into quiet, and I held that life the way you hold a small, warm animal, gently, aware of how easily it can be startled. I had met Carol 3 times before the wedding. The first was at a restaurant in the city where she had arrived in a cream silk blouse, ordered sparkling water, and smiled at me from across the table with a warmth that felt carefully calibrated, the temperature of a room that has been set rather than lived in. The second was a family Christmas at Daniel's sister's house, a gathering that felt more like a performance review than a holiday. Carol moved through the rooms with the unhurried authority of someone who considers herself the standard against which others are measured. She complimented my dress. "That color is so brave on you," and asked about my work with such focused attention that I answered more than I meant to before I realized I was being assessed. The third time was the Sunday morning she appeared at Daniel's apartment door, unannounced while I was still there, still in my pajamas, still holding a coffee mug. She had looked at me with a smile so perfectly pleasant it gave nothing away, and settled in on the couch and stayed for 4 hours. I left early, claiming an appointment, and spent the drive home trying to name what unsettled me. It was something in her questions, I decided. She asked them the way a doctor takes a patient's pulse, without urgency, without malice, but with complete and professional purpose. "Where did you say your family was from? And the house your grandmother left you? No mortgage? Just yours outright? No siblings to share with?" Each question wrapped in such warm, unhurried curiosity that it took 20 minutes of driving to realize I had been interviewed. At the wedding, she wept during the vows, beautiful, photogenic tears, dabbed with a folded white handkerchief. She hugged me in the receiving line and said, "Welcome to the family, sweetheart," and held the embrace 1 beat longer than felt natural. I told myself I had been unfair, that I was projecting, that some women simply needed time to accept a daughter-in-law, and Carol was clearly making the effort. I practiced being fair for the next 2 years. I hosted her for Thanksgiving and Easter. I called on her birthday and remembered, always, to ask about her book club and her garden and her church friends by name. I sat in the kitchen every Sunday morning while Daniel took her calls, 30 minutes, 40, once nearly an hour, and told myself that this was simply who he was, a devoted son. I had always loved that about him, I reminded myself. I continued to remind myself, but I noticed the calls. I noticed that Daniel emerged from them slightly different, quieter, more distracted, sometimes carrying a new opinion about something domestic that had not been his opinion the previous week. Once, after a long Sunday call, he came to the kitchen where I was chopping vegetables for dinner and stood in the doorway watching me for a moment before saying, "She thinks the vegetable garden is making the yard look cluttered." I turned from the counter and looked at him carefully. "It's our yard," I said. He agreed. We kept the garden. But the air between us had changed in a way I could feel and not measure, and I filed it away with all the other small things I was not yet ready to examine directly. The first serious alarm arrived in October, 2 years into the marriage, in the form of a phone call from Patricia. I was at my desk at work, 3 years into a project management role I had worked hard to earn, the kind of job where you learn to read a room before you have finished walking into it, when her name appeared on my phone screen. Patricia was 72, retired, and had lived next door to my grandmother for 30 years. She was the kind of neighbor who notices everything and says nothing unless it genuinely matters. "Sarah," she said when I answered, "I don't want to pry, but a woman came to the house this morning. She had a key." I set down my coffee cup very carefully. "What woman?" It took me a moment to recognize her, but it's Daniel's mother. She let herself in through the front door. She was inside for about 40 minutes. I saw her leave carrying a cardboard box, medium-sized. She brought it to her car herself. I thanked Patricia and sat perfectly still at my desk for a full minute. Then I called Daniel. He answered on the third ring, and when I described what Patricia had told me, there was a pause. Brief. 2 seconds, perhaps, but dense enough that I felt it drop through the phone line like a stone dropping through deep water. "Oh," he said. "Right. Sorry, I should have mentioned. She needed to pick up her casserole dish. She thought she'd left it here last time she visited." I turned this over in my mind. "She has a key to our house?" Another pause. Lighter this time, more practiced. "I made her a copy, a while back, for emergencies. In case something happened and we needed someone to get in, it just seemed practical." A small, half-apologetic laugh. "Is that a problem?" I said no. I don't know why I said no. I think I was still practicing being fair. The renovation story began in January. Carol called on a Sunday morning while Daniel and I were still in bed, the winter light flat and pale through the curtains, the house cold enough that I was pressed close to him for warmth. Their call lasted 45 minutes. I lay beside him and listened to the murmur of his voice, accommodating, careful, carrying a particular quality of carefulness that had its own specific texture. And I knew, before he hung up, that whatever was coming, he had already agreed to it. He came back under the covers and stared at the ceiling. "Her bathroom's being renovated," he said. "The contractor says it'll take 3 weeks, maybe 4. A pause. I told her she could stay in the guest room. The guest room? My grandmother's guest room, where the handmade quilt Gran had stitched in the 1970s, still lay folded across the foot of the bed, where the smell was still, faintly, cedar and old paperbacks and that sweet, unnameable thing. I kept my voice level. "For how long?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. The repetition sat in the air between us. I said I needed to think about it. He said, "Of course, take your time." 2 hours later, while I was in the garden turning the winter compost with a spade, working the cold, dark earth the way Gran had taught me, he came to the back door and told me he had already confirmed with his mother that she could come on Friday. Carol arrived with 2 suitcases, a hanging garment bag, a large crate of personal items wrapped in newspaper, and a slow cooker. She stood in the entryway and looked around with her calibrated smile and said, "Oh, Sarah, this house, it just gets lovelier every time I visit." She said it the way someone says they can see the potential of a space while already mentally moving the furniture. I smiled and showed her to the guest room and did not say what I was thinking. The first week was almost manageable. She was careful, up early, cheerful at dinner, polite about knocking. She asked if she could rearrange the spice rack because she had a system and found it easier to cook that way. I said sure. She asked if her throw blanket could live on the couch. I said of course. She asked about a small floor lamp for the guest room because the overhead light gave her headaches. Each request was perfectly reasonable in isolation. It was the accumulation I could not name yet, the slow, patient deposition of her preferences over mine, layer by layer, the way silt settles over a riverbed until the original contours are buried and forgotten. By the end of the second week, I had begun, in small but specific ways, to feel like a guest in my own home. By the end of that second week, the contractor had also discovered a problem with the pipes. 3 weeks became 6. Carol relayed this at dinner with a sigh of such convincing dismay that I almost felt sorry for her. Daniel reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Of course you stay as long as you need," he said, as though the house were his to offer. I looked at my plate and did not speak. She began answering the landline when it rang. She moved my grandmother's cast iron pans to the cabinet above the refrigerator, where I could not reach them without a step stool. "Just to make the counter space more logical," she explained, with her pleasantest smile. She answered my father's Saturday call twice in a row, telling him I was resting before I even knew he had called. She offered opinions on the grocery list. She rearranged the linen closet. She mentioned gently, only once, that the lavender along the front walk was a little wild-looking and that she knew a very good landscaper. I lay awake at night beside my sleeping husband and listened to the sounds of the house, the tick of the baseboard heat, the distant breath of traffic, the occasional creak of the floorboards, and tried to locate the exact source of the cold, dense weight that had settled in my chest. Carol had been in my home for 23 days. She had a key to my front door. She had my grandmother's cast-iron pans on a shelf I couldn't reach. She had twice intercepted my father's calls without telling me. I told myself I was overreacting. I said it to myself the way you repeat a word until it loses its meaning. I was not overreacting. I was simply not yet paying close enough attention. The moment I finally began paying proper attention arrived on a Thursday evening in late February. Carol was at a church friend's dinner. Daniel was working late at his firm. I came home to an empty house which felt like a gift, just the pale lamplight and the tick of the radiator and the smell of cedar and old wood. I poured a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table and let myself miss my grandmother with a simple, uncomplicated ache, the kind that doesn't need to be resolved. Then I went to Daniel's studio to leave a note on his drafting table about the plumber coming the following morning. The drafting table was covered in its usual organized mess. Rolled blueprints, pencil cases, a half-full coffee mug with a dried ring inside. But sitting slightly to one side, open, was a manila folder. The tab read, in Carol's handwriting, I recognized the looping, careful letters immediately. Maple Creek. I stood very still for a moment. Then I reached out and turned the folder toward me. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a printed real estate assessment of the house, dated 6 weeks ago. The second was a handwritten summary of something titled Joint Tenancy versus Tenancy in Common, with several lines underlined and annotations crowding the margins. The third was a draft letter, typed and printed, addressed to a family law attorney whose name I did not recognize, outlining what it described as a proposed arrangement for equitable distribution of the marital asset currently held solely in the name of Sarah Whitmore. My name, in a legal document, on my husband's drafting table, in a folder with my grandmother's address written on the tab. I stood there until my legs stopped feeling entirely real beneath me. The wine glass was still in my hand. I don't know how long I stood there, long enough for the light outside the window to shift from pale gray to full dark, long enough for the radiator to go through 2 full clicking cycles, long enough to understand, with a terrible and crystalline clarity, that this had been going on for some time, that the renovation was not a renovation, that the guest room was not temporary, that Carol's patient, careful rearrangement of my spice rack and my linen closet and my grandmother's cast-iron pans had never, not for a single day, been about the spice rack. It had always been about the house. I did not close the folder. I stood at the drafting table and read every word of every document a second time, slowly, the way you reread something when your mind refuses to believe what your eyes have already processed. The real estate assessment was thorough. 3 pages, professional letterhead, comps from the surrounding neighborhood going back 5 years. Someone had paid for that assessment. Someone had given an appraiser the address and invited them to the house, which meant someone had either been here or had given permission for someone else to come. The attorney's draft letter was worse. It used language I was not entirely fluent in, but I understood enough. The phrase marital asset appeared 4 times. The phrase equitable distribution appeared 3 times. There was a line near the bottom that read, in the clipped, impersonal grammar of legal correspondence, our client believes that a voluntary renegotiation of the current title arrangement would be preferable to a formal dispute proceeding. Our client. I read those 2 words 3 times. Our client. Carol had an attorney. Carol had been in contact with an attorney. About my house. About my grandmother's house. My hand was shaking. I noticed this the way you notice something from a distance, objectively, without quite connecting it to yourself. The wine glass was still in my other hand, and I set it down carefully on the edge of the drafting table before I spilled it. Then I stood there, with both hands at my sides, and breathed through my nose and tried to think. The thought that kept arriving, again and again, the way a wave keeps arriving even when you've turned your back to the ocean, was, Daniel knew. He had to know. This was his studio. This was his table. The folder was open, sitting in plain sight, not hidden, not even closed. And the handwriting on the tab was not his, which meant someone else had placed it here, and the only someone else who had been in this house with any regularity, with a key and 45 minutes of unsupervised privacy and a slow cooker and a throw blanket on the living room couch, was Carol. I took photographs of every page with my phone. Then I closed the folder and put it back exactly as I had found it, at the same angle, the same position. I went to the kitchen. I poured the wine down the drain. I sat at the pine table where my grandmother had taught me to make pie crust, and I pressed my palms flat against the wood, and I stayed there until I heard Daniel's key in the front door. He came in carrying his laptop bag and smelling of cold night air, and smiled when he saw me. The familiar open smile I had loved for 4 years, and said, "Hey, did you eat yet?" And I looked at his face, the face I knew so completely I could have drawn it from memory, and I said yes, I wasn't hungry. I watched him move to the refrigerator, pour himself a glass of water, roll his neck to one side, and I thought, when were you going to tell me? How long had this been happening while I was tending things, while I was polishing my grandmother's cast iron pans with linseed oil the way she had taught me? I said nothing that night. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was looking at before I said a single word out loud. I went to bed and lay in the dark while Daniel slept beside me, and I stared at the ceiling and cataloged everything. Every question Carol had asked, every subtle rearrangement, every Sunday phone call, every detail that had seemed individually benign, and now, in sequence, formed a pattern so clear I couldn't understand how I had failed to see it sooner. She had not moved in because of a bathroom renovation. She had moved in to establish presence, occupation. She was building a case, or at minimum a narrative, that this house was a family home, that she belonged here, that the title, one name, my name, the name my grandmother had written on a deed with her careful looping hand, was an oversight in need of correction. I called Lily the following morning from my car in the parking garage at work, with the engine running and the windows fogged with cold. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Sarah, you need to call an attorney today, not tomorrow, today." I said I knew. She said, "Do you want me to come over?" I said, "Not yet." I said I needed a few more days to understand what I was dealing with. She said, "You already know what you're dealing with." She was right. I already knew. I called Margaret Holloway that afternoon, a property and family law specialist recommended by a colleague who had gone through her own complicated divorce 2 years earlier. Margaret's assistant scheduled a call for the following day. I spent that evening at home behaving exactly as I always did. I made dinner. I asked Carol about her church friends. I listened to Daniel describe a project at his firm. I kept my face as smooth and ordinary as I had ever kept it. Underneath, I was building something, a cold, precise architecture of attention that I had never built before. The call with Margaret lasted an hour. She was brisk, efficient, and completely unsurprised by anything I told her. "The good news," she said, "is that sole ownership inherited pre-marriage with no mortgage is quite well protected. The better news is that you don't need to wait for them to make a formal move. You can act first." She told me exactly what to do. I wrote it down. Then I went home and made dinner and waited. The confrontation I had been both dreading and preparing for arrived that Sunday, in a form I had not anticipated. Carol came to the kitchen while I was washing the breakfast dishes and stood in the doorway with her hands folded and said, with the careful pleasantness of someone who has rehearsed, "Sarah, darling, I've been wanting to talk to you. I hope you're open to a conversation." I turned off the tap. I dried my hands on the dish towel. I turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at her directly. "Of course," I said. "What about?" She settled herself at the kitchen table as though it were hers, smoothing her cardigan, and said, I've been thinking about the future, about Daniel's future, about what it means to build a family. She paused, letting the words settle. This house is beautiful. It's clearly very important to you. But I do think, and I say this with love, that it might be worth considering a more formal arrangement, something that recognizes Daniel's contribution to this home, something equitable. She gave me the smile that did not reach her eyes, sharp, patient, certain. Are you talking about the title? I said. Her smile widened slightly, the smile of someone who has been waiting for a direct question. I'm talking about fairness, darling, about what's right. And did you consult an attorney about what's right? I asked. My voice was quiet, completely level. The smile flickered. Just for a half second, a barely perceptible dimming, a recovery so fast you might have doubted you'd seen it. I've simply done some research, she said, as any concerned mother would. I see, I said, and I did. I saw all of it. That evening, Daniel came home to find me at the kitchen table with my laptop open. I turned the screen toward him without a word. On it were the photographs I had taken of the documents in his studio. His face moved through several expressions in quick succession. Recognition, alarm, something that might have been guilt, before settling into a careful blankness that was, in many ways, worse than any of the others. Sarah, he began. How long have you known? I said. He looked at the table. She mentioned it a few weeks ago. She said she thought it was worth exploring. I told her to slow down. But you didn't tell me. He looked up. What was on his face was not guilt, exactly. It was the look of a man who had been managing two versions of the truth simultaneously for so long that he could no longer clearly locate the line between them. I was going to, he said. I just didn't want things to escalate. Things have already escalated, I said quietly. I simply wasn't informed. He reached across the table. Sarah. Did you know she had an attorney? A pause, longer than the others. I knew she had spoken to someone. I didn't know it had gone that far. I looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was very quiet. The radiator clicked. Outside, a car moved past on the street. I thought about the white roses at our wedding and the way he had pressed his palm against the hallway plaster and said, "This house has good bones." I thought about the way he had said, "Of course, you stay as long as you need," across a dinner table in a house that was not his to offer. I thought about the locks. The promise he would make in 2 days, whispered into my hair. The promise that was already, apparently, a joke. I'd like you to ask your mother to leave, I said. He said he would talk to her. He said he was sorry, that he should have told me sooner, that he had been trying to keep the peace. I said I understood. I went to bed before him that night and lay in the dark and thought about the steps I had already begun to take and about what it means exactly to keep the peace. It had always meant the same thing in this house, me absorbing the noise quietly and calling it quiet. The worst dinner came that Sunday. Carol arrived with a folder of her own, which she set on the table between the bread basket and the salad bowl, with the composure of a woman who believes she has already won and is simply present to collect. Inside was a draft quit-claim deed, partially filled out, transferring a 50% interest in the property to Daniel James Whitmore. There was a line at the bottom for my signature. I looked at the document. I looked at Carol. I looked at Daniel, who was looking at the table with the particular careful blankness I now recognized as his method of being present and absent simultaneously. Then I picked up the document, folded it along its original crease, and set it on the chair beside me. "No," I said. Carol's expression did not change. "Sarah, I think you should read it carefully before—" "I have read it. No. This isn't about you and me," she said, the warmth precisely maintained. "This is about Daniel's security, about what he deserves as your husband, as someone who has built a life here. He has a home," I said. "This one. Because I invited him here." The warmth in Carol's face thinned. Not disappeared, but thinned, the way a cloud thins when the wind moves through it. A wife who refuses to share her assets, she said carefully, who keeps everything in her own name. That's not a partnership, Sarah. The word partnership sat in the air of my grandmother's kitchen, like something that did not belong there. I thought of Gran's letter. I thought of the word tend. I thought of all the Sundays I had sat at this table practicing being fair. I'd like you to leave, I said. My voice was the quietest it had ever been, and somehow it was the most weight I had ever put behind words. Take your things from the guest room. Leave the key on the table. This is the last conversation we'll have in this house. The silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Carol looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the table. I looked at Carol and did not blink and did not look away. She left 2 hours later. Daniel came to the kitchen afterward and held me and whispered about the locks, and I pressed my face into his shoulder and let him, because I needed to know what he would do. I needed to see it clearly. Patricia showed me the video 48 hours after that. 11:47 p.m., Carol and Daniel in my driveway laughing together in the dark. I watched it 4 times. I handed the phone back. I drove home. I was very calm. I went to Daniel's studio and took the manila folder. I sat at the kitchen table and called Margaret Holloway. I left a message. Then I called Lily, and she picked up on the first ring, and I told her what Patricia had shown me. Lily said, "I'm coming over." I said, "Yes, please." She sat across from me and listened while I said everything out loud, in order, all of it. When I finished, she looked at me and said, "What do you want to do?" I told her. She nodded. She said, "Then let's do it." Margaret filed the cease and desist that week, directed at Carol's attorney, formal and precise and without sentiment. A certified letter went to Daniel informing him that all further discussions regarding the property title were to be routed through legal counsel. On Thursday morning, while Daniel was at work, a locksmith named Roy came to the house and changed every exterior lock in 90 minutes. I watched from the front porch with a mug of tea, my hands warm around the ceramic, the cold February air sharp in my lungs. When Roy finished and drove away, I stood alone on my grandmother's porch and felt, for the first time in months, something that was not the cold stone of dread, something that balanced rather than burdened, something that was mine. Daniel came home to a new key on the kitchen table and a note that said simply, "I had the locks changed. This is yours." He stood in the kitchen holding the key, and then he sat down, and we talked for 3 hours. He cried once. I did not. He said he was sorry. The slow, effortful kind, the kind that doesn't ask for anything back. He said he had known about the attorney for 6 weeks, not 2. He said he was ashamed of this. I told him that shame was a beginning, not an ending, but that I needed him to understand clearly. This house would remain in my name. It was not a negotiation. It had never been a negotiation. My grandmother had left it to me, and I would tend it, and that was not going to change. He nodded. He said he understood. He said he should have said those words. Exactly those words, exactly that clearly, long before now. Carol did not take the cease and desist quietly. She called Daniel 6 times over the following 3 days. He answered the first call and let the remaining 5 go to voicemail. She sent a handwritten letter claiming she had only ever wanted what was best for her son and that I had weaponized the legal system against a grieving mother. I read it once, photographed it for Margaret's files, and placed it in the recycling bin. Carol's attorney responded within 10 days, acknowledging the cease and desist and confirming his client would not be pursuing the matter further. Margaret called me on a Tuesday morning to deliver the news. "That's the end of it," she said, "legally at least." I said I understood. She said, "Take care of yourself." The harder ending, the one that took longer and cost more, was Daniel. We stayed in the house together through the spring, navigating something without a clean name. Not separation, not yet reconciliation, but the careful daily work of 2 people determining whether what remained between them was enough to build on, or whether it was only habit and proximity and a shared love of a pale yellow house at the end of a road. Some evenings were almost like before. Dinner at the table, the porch in the late light, the easy quiet of two people who know each other's rhythms. Other evenings carried the weight of what had not been said, what had been agreed to in secret, what had been laughed about in a driveway at 11:47 p.m. By August, we were in couples counseling. It was slow work, the kind that requires you to say things out loud that you have kept perfectly organized inside your own head and watch them become complicated again in the air between two people. Daniel said things I had needed him to say for years. I said things I had kept smooth and fair and quiet because I had been practicing being fair, practicing not making it harder than it needed to be, practicing not being the kind of wife who caused problems. Our therapist, a calm woman named Dr. Ellis, who kept a philodendron on her windowsill the size of a small tree, said that the opposite of conflict avoidance is not conflict. It is honesty. I wrote that down. In October, 8 months after the folder on the drafting table, Daniel and I sat on the front porch on an evening that smelled like turned earth and cooling air, and something faintly sweet I still could not name. The lavender along the walk had been cut back for the season. It would come back in the spring, wilder and fuller than before. He was sketching on a paper napkin. He never stopped doing that, and I had never stopped finding it quietly endearing, and I held on to that fact carefully. I was holding a mug of tea, watching the light go out of the sky over the roof line of the house across the street. "I called my mother today," he said, not looking up from the napkin. I waited. I told her that if she wanted a relationship with us, with me, it would need to look completely different. No keys, no attorneys, no plans made without Sarah. He paused. She cried. Another pause. I waited until she finished, and then I said it again. I looked at the side of his face. I thought about the word tend, like a garden, like something that needs patience and the willingness to do the same unglamorous work over and over without guarantee of outcome. "What did she say?" I asked. "She said she'd think about it." He set down the napkin and looked at me. I told her to take her time. The porch light came on automatically as the sky darkened. Moths arrived, as they always did, turning small pale circles in the light. Somewhere down the road, a dog was barking at something that had already moved on. The house behind me ticked and breathed with the rhythms I had memorized before I was 10 years old, and I felt the weight of it. Not the cold stone I had carried through the winter, but something older and more sustaining. The weight of belonging. The weight of a place that holds you and remembers. I had lost something in the past 8 months, the uncomplicated certainty, the kind that rests without asking questions, the kind that has never been tested. I would not get that back, and I had stopped pretending otherwise. What I had instead was something harder and more honest, a marriage I had looked at directly, in full light, and chosen to continue working on, a house that remained entirely mine, a set of locks whose keys I had chosen, carefully and deliberately, who to give. My grandmother had written in her looping, careful hand, "I trust you to 10 things, not to protect them fiercely from all harm, not to preserve them unchanged, to tend them with patience, with attention, with the willingness to do the slow and unglamorous work that no one sees, and that makes all the difference." I took a sip of tea. The night air smelled like cedar and something sweet I still could not name. I was home,